After days on a razor's edge, Ukraine is now a nation at war.
A democratic country has been invaded by its nuclear-armed neighbor on multiple fronts. People are not safe in their own homes.
One of the major fallouts of the Russia-Ukraine war has been the rising energy costs.
Parts of Europe are going dark. It's just the latest fallout from the continent's ongoing energy crisis.
This year in Europe has been dominated by the fallout from Russia's war in Ukraine. Energy is the biggest pinch point.
Energy crisis.
Energy crisis.
Energy crisis.
Energy crisis.
Energy crisis.
Energy crisis.
Energy crisis. Energy crisis. Energy crisis. Energy crisis. Energy crisis. Energy.
The Ukraine crisis has taken a tragic toll, but what most people don't realize is that the conflict has also been an energy war. The volatile situation has caused an energy crisis in Europe, leading to recession and inflation, making life even tougher in the region. But we've been here before.
The oil-producing countries of the Arab world decided to use their oil as a political weapon.
At the height of the embargo, 500,000 people were thrown out of work.
From energy shortages in the 70s to the crises of today, one thing is clear. The world's energy needs are ever-changing, and managing them isn't easy. Stay tuned until the end as we take a look back to the energy crisis of '73 and explore what practical lessons it can teach us about our current crisis. When Russian forces descended onto Ukraine's soil in 2022, the West denounced the invasion and swiftly put forth sanctions. Naturally, Russia retaliated by cutting off its gas supplies to Europe, a powerful reminder of the Kremlin's uncompromising influence. The 1973 oil embargo serves as a reminder that holding energy to ransom doesn't always work out. OPEC's retaliation, cutting off oil supply to the West, seemed like a logical move, yet it resulted in an immediate economic shock felt across the globe, with no apparent long-term gain. It was also a tough lesson for Americans who had become so heavily dependent on Middle Eastern soil for 83% of their imports. Before the 1973 embargo, security in the energy sector didn't seem to be a major concern for the US. That is, until Arab producers attempted to use their leverage against American foreign policy and dominated the news headlines with their power play. It was a stark reminder of what happens when a nation becomes too dependent on imports. In the 70s, energy had become a weapon. With the world so heavily relying on oil, it was only a matter of time until Middle Eastern producers took control of the market. Away from the West, and especially the US, it was a moment of inflection that shifted the balance of power in one fell swoop. America had been self-sufficient in energy production until the 1950s, and while it continued to be a major oil producer as the century went on, it just couldn't produce enough for its own requirements. Because of its reliance on Middle Eastern imports, America's economy suffered when the global oil market's power dynamics changed. The American economy was having a terrible time. Since there was a shortage of oil and oil-related products, gas was also in short supply. The countries with abundant natural resources immediately understood that they might influence the situation by limiting oil supplies.
They will reduce oil production by 5% a month until the Israelis withdraw from occupied territories. If the Arab countries keep that pledge, it would reduce their production by almost 50% in 1 year.
American oil imports from OPEC decreased by about half during the embargo. The cost doubled over the subsequent few years.
A point where the economy was already fragile. The country was confronting serious inflation. The Arab embargo in 1973 then exacerbated the inflationary impact and tipped everything into a serious economic crisis.
Nonetheless, despite the gloomy prognosis, others saw a way out of the dilemma. At the time, The Economist cited the brilliant economist Lawrence Edelman, a professor at MIT, as saying that if the Arabs don't sell oil, someone else will. Edelman was accurate. Even if America paid more, the oil continued to flow. A few nations, including the United States, received a refusal from the Arab to sell oil in exchange for their backing of Israel. Yet they persisted in selling oil to other nations. Thus, those cargoes were diverted at a greater cost once the oil arrived at the marketplace, accompanied by middlemen making money on the way to the markets that required that oil. Although prices increased, the US did receive the oil it required. OPEC had a change of heart just 5 months into their oil embargo against the US. And get this, it wasn't because the US changed its stance on the conflict or suddenly found new oil reserves. Nope. Turns out oil is a global commodity that's connected to every other barrel out there. As long as there's a demand for it, that black gold will find its way to market one way or another. Fast forward 50 years, and Europe is learning the same lesson all over again. Despite trying to diversify their energy supplies, they're still getting the most of their oil from Russia. But now it's being refined in India and sold at a higher price. Talk about a sneaky move. Looks like Russia is actually making more money off their oil than ever before. Another lesson the world has failed to learn from the oil crisis of the 1970s is highlighted by the fact that Russia is currently making more money from oil. Having a variety of sources of supply, rather than being unduly dependent on one, as Germany was a few years ago, when 55% of its natural gas came from Russia. Diversify your sources because doing so is a surefire way to ensure lack of security. The 1973 oil shock led to a shift in public opinion, particularly in the US government's perspective on energy security.
At the end of this decade, in the year 1980, the United States will not be dependent on any other country for the energy we need to provide our jobs, to heat our homes, and to keep our transportation moving.
Well, it looks like America got the memo and started ramping up its domestic oil production to become energy self-sufficient once again. But Europe must have missed that memo because in 2021, a quarter of their energy still comes from Russia. Talk about a bad case of dependence on a hostile state. The current energy shock we're experiencing can actually be traced back to natural gas. During the Ukraine war, Russia put the squeeze on Europe by cutting off most of their natural gas supplies via pipeline. And get this, in 2021, the EU imported a whopping 83% of its natural gas, with almost half of that coming from Russia. As Putin threatens to cut oil production and retaliate against Western embargoes and price caps, there are fears that the price of oil could also spiral out of control. Ah, the good old oil shocks of the 70s. It's like history is repeating itself all over again. Gasoline prices are through the roof, oil supplies are running dry, and Western leaders are sweating bullets trying to curb inflation. Ugh, talk about a scourge that just won't quit. But hold up, folks. Today's energy market is a whole different ballgame from 50 years ago. Thanks to our hyper-connected world, shocks in one place can now wreak havoc on a global scale. Yikes. Back in the 70s, gas was seen as a useful alternative to oil. But this time around, it's part of the problem. Russia has been using natural gas as a weapon against Europe by cutting off supplies, and now they're threatening to do the same with oil. Despite recent drops in wholesale prices, European gas costs have skyrocketed to unprecedented levels in 2022. We're talking a whopping 177% higher than just 2 years ago. Yikes. Now, Europe may be trying to reduce its reliance on Russian gas, but let's face it, only 2 countries have completely halted imports. Britain is getting most of its gas from Norway, smart move guys, while Lithuania has replaced their Russian gas with supplies from America. But even with these efforts, Russian gas is still making its way into Europe. So, what's the solution? Well, for now at least, Europe will still need to use some Russian gas, but the bigger share of Europe's gas will increasingly come from imports by sea. That fancy pants LNG, that's liquefied natural gas for you non-energy types. Basically, they freeze the natural gas at the source and ship it over to be regasified on European shores. Sounds cool and all, but here's the kicker. The West's search for alternative energy suppliers has had unintended consequences. Oh boy. The energy crisis of 2022, exposing tensions left and right, including the good old-fashioned hypocrisy of Europe. They're basically gobbling up all the world's LNG, paying hefty premiums to make sure their own markets are well supplied. Classic. But here's the thing. Western countries with deep pockets are outbidding poorer ones for fuel. Countries like Bangladesh, Thailand, and Pakistan are getting priced out of the global LNG market, leaving them high and dry without the energy they need. And let's not forget that if the West ignores this lesson, yet again, it'll be the global South that suffers disproportionately. Remember the 1973 oil embargo? Yeah, that was a wake-up call for America about relying too heavily on imported oil. It also highlighted the need to invest in other sources of energy. Looks like we still have some work to do on that front. Back in the day, everyone was jumping on the coal train like it was going out of style. The Germans might have been too cool for that scene, but Poland and other European countries were all aboard. Meanwhile, the French were like, nuclear power, baby, and then solar power started making waves. It seemed like we were on the brink of an energy revolution, which led to some good things like conservation efforts and fuel economy standards for cars. Go America! But even with rising energy prices, people were still hooked on fossil fuels. In fact, during the oil shock of the 70s, companies found it more profitable to make oil usage more efficient than to replace it entirely with renewable sources. Nowadays, though, we can't afford to play those games anymore. Climate change is real and we need to take action ASAP. So, we all know that transitioning from fossil fuels to clean energy is gonna take a hot minute. But here's the kicker. We don't really have that kind of time. Climate change is breathing down our necks, so for the first time in human history, we're trying to speed up the process and get it done in a decade or two, which is basically like trying to win a marathon in high heels. While that mind-bending image sears itself into your brain, take a second to hit that subscribe button if you're digging what we're throwing down. And don't be shy. Drop us a comment and let us know what you think. We can take it. But let's not forget the bigger picture here. We need to diversify our energy sources and find alternatives to those dirty fossil fuels. Maybe it's nuclear power, wind turbines, solar panels, or geothermal energy. Who knows? The point is, we gotta mix it up. Unfortunately, when winter rolled around and Europe was facing an energy crisis that could lead to tens of thousands of extra deaths, yikes, governments had to scramble for quick solutions. And while relying on coal or offering price subsidies might keep the lights on in the short term, there's a risk that these band-aid fixes will actually encourage more energy use and slow down the transition towards cleaner sources. We can't afford to go backwards now. That would be like taking one step forward and 2 steps back at a dance party. Not cool. Even with the looming threat of environmental disasters, we're still at risk of ignoring the lessons of history. Sure, we learned some stuff from the 1973 oil embargo, but apparently not enough. And now we don't have time to twiddle our thumbs and ponder life's mysteries. Action needs to be taken ASAP. But hey, it's not all doom and gloom. Russia's use of energy as a weapon has reminded us that the energy transition isn't just about climate change. It's also about security and affordability, aka money. Our obsession with fossil fuels comes at a hefty price, and it's about darn time we start investing in alternatives. Another thing you need to start investing in is time. That is, in watching more of our videos.